Okay, folks, it looks like it's time to get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining our live lecture today. My name is Isaac, and I'll be the lead instructor for the lecture. And today's topic will be Front-End Foundations Part 1. So what that means is this lecture will cover the first half of the Front-End Foundations curriculum. So if you're in that section, this is the lecture for you. A couple things to mention before we get started today. The first one being is that we're going to be stopping periodically throughout this lecture to open the floor for questions. So if you do have those come up along the way, we just ask that you wait until those designated times to ask them. Another thing to mention is that we're recording this lecture. So once we're done here, we're going to post it on our YouTube channel. We're going to make that link available to you in your student dashboard. So getting started, let's go ahead and discuss what topics we'll be learning about today. And there's three core ones we'll be focusing on, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And by now, you should have been introduced to all three of these on a very basic level. And so today we'll be doing a little bit of review and going a little more deep into these topics. Okay, so we'll start with HTML. So HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language, and it's the most basic building block of any web page. It defines the contents and basic layouts of a web page. Okay, so you can think of it as like the skeleton. So what makes up the HTML skeleton is a set of tags. Okay, and so we got an HTML tag, and this is the top level parent element for a web page. We've got a head tag, which is the element that contains title and links. Okay, and that's what we see up here. We've got the title, the inner HTML appears in the browser tab, and then we got the body, and that's the element that contains the visible page content. So let's go ahead and create an HTML skeleton with the phrase "Hello World" in the body. So how we'll do this is I'll go ahead and I will change directories to my desktop, make a new directory called Front-End Foundations, and then I'm going to open up that in my text editor. Okay, Front-End Foundations, FEF. Okay, so opens there. And from here, we can see that we have just this empty project, right? So we can go ahead and start by adding an HTML doc. So I'll call mine index.html, and I'll add it to the root. So from here, we can go ahead and we can start by using the parent HTML element, and then we're going to nest this head element. And you notice when I nest an element, I indented one space. Okay, and within the head, I'm going to put a title. That title is going to appear in the browser, so I'll just put Front-End Foundations. Okay, right below the head, I'm going to put a body, just like it would be on a regular human. Okay, and then the body is where all the visible page content will be. So I'm just going to say "Hello World." Okay, so now to see this in our browser, we simply need to copy the path of the index, and then we'll go ahead and we'll paste it right on in our browser. Okay, and we can see that we're getting "Hello World." Okay, so we're successfully able to load in that doc and display something using this basic HTML skeleton. Okay, so now let's talk about some common body elements. Okay, so first we got header elements, which range from H1 to H6. Okay, and they are, for like, article subject lines, right? Stuff you want to, attract lots of attention to would be a header. A paragraph would be, the text of like an article, right? Where it's just, a standard font. Then you've got ordered and unordered list elements, and these are a parent element for a list item, which will display either numbers or bullets next to each item, depending on which parent you nest it in. And then you've got a form element, and this form element normally contains input and button elements, and this is for submitting data. And then finally, we've got an anchor element, and this anchor element has what's called href, a hyperlink attribute, which we can reference and we can navigate to other web pages. So let's go ahead and create a mock blog web page using all the common body elements. So let's go ahead and let's start at the top here with the title of our blog. Okay, so let's just call it How to Code. Okay, and you notice that I used an H1 for that. Okay, because I want to emphasize this. Okay, so if I save all, when we refresh, we can see that this is much more emphasized, right? It's much larger, bold, okay? And so that's the standard for header. But like I mentioned before too, we can do H1, H2, H3, right? And each size you do from H1 goes down smaller. H1 being the largest, H6 being the smallest. Okay, so depending on what you're using, you might want H1, 2, 3, 4, right? Just depends on your aesthetic. Okay, so now we need some paragraph text. Okay, so I'm going to use a paragraph element for that. I'm just going to use some placeholder text for now. Okay. Okay, that should be good. So now we can save all, refresh, okay, and we can see that it's much smaller, right? And much more standard to what we would expect when reading like a blog article or something. Okay, so now let's say within this article, we want to list the particular steps a person needs to take to get started. Okay, so if they're going to take steps, let's list them with ordered list. Okay, so an ordered list uses a UL element for the parent, and then for the child, I'll use the list item. And then within the list item, oops, let's make this OL, so we'll actually have numbers next to each one. Okay, and we'll say to get started, you need to get a computer and sign up for a learning course. Okay, and then practice. Okay, so those are 3 things you need to do to get started. So let's go ahead and let's save all. And when we refresh, we can see that it lists these, in nice order for us, and we didn't have to, come in here, and we didn't have to hard code those integers, right? It just does it for us using this ordered list element. Okay, and so let's say now we want to list the technologies they need to learn. And let's say we just want bullet points next to each of those. Okay, so if that's the case, we could say HTML, CSS, JavaScript. Okay, now when we refresh, we can see in contrast, we get bullet points instead of the integers. Okay, and that's how we can use lists. Okay, so now let's say at the bottom of our article here, we want a form so they can contact the author. So let's go ahead and let's just put an H1 here. Let's say contact author, and then we'll put a form right below that. Within this form, we're going to put an input, and this will have a placeholder for person's email. That way the author can get back to them at their email. Okay, so now we can save all, and when we refresh, you can see we get a nice little form down here, right, ready to submit our email. Okay, so finally, let's go ahead and let's set up a link to where they can navigate to a page and read about the author. So I'm going to start off by creating an about HTML right in my root. Okay, and I'll just start with the head and the title. I'll go ahead and call it about. And then for the body, we'll go ahead and put an H1. We'll say about the author. Oops. And then we'll just put some placeholder text here. Okay, so now to navigate to about HTML, I could use an anchor element. Okay, so I would simply say a with an href attribute pointing to about.html. Okay, so we could save all. And when we refresh, you can see we got a nice little link down here where we could read about the author. So we click on that, we can see that it redirects us to that web page. Okay. Next, let's go ahead and move on to the topic of CSS. So CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets and is a style sheet language used for configuring the presentation of a web page. So if HTML is the bones, you can think of CSS as very much like the skin of our document. Okay, so that being said, let's go ahead and talk about CSS selectors. Okay, so a CSS selector references the HTML element you want to style. The declaration block contains one or more declarations separated by semicolons. Okay, so as you can see, this is the element, and these are the styles we want to apply. So that being said, let's go and dive into the different kinds of selectors we can use. Okay, so the first one's called an ID selector. And the ID selector uses the ID attribute of an HTML element to select a specific element. So as you can see, we just reference the ID, preface it with a hashtag, and then throw in our style. Next, we got what's called an element selector. And the element selector selects all elements with a specified element name, such as H1, paragraph tag, anchor tag, right? So it'll group them all together and apply that style. Next, we got the class selector. The class selector uses the class attribute of an HTML element to select a specific group of elements. Okay, so unlike the ID selector, this is used to select multiple instead of just one. As you can see, we just preface this with a dot. Next, we'll talk about the descendant selector. So the descendant selector matches all elements that are descendants of a specified element. Okay, so for example, maybe you have a form, and inside that form you have an input, and you want to style that input. This is the approach you would take. Next, let's talk about a pseudo selector. Okay, so a pseudo class is used to find a special state of an element. Okay, so basically this style will only be applied when a specific browser event has taken place. So when, for example, an element is hovered over, we could apply a pseudo selector that then applies a specific style. Okay, so let's use our element ID, class, descendant, and pseudo selectors to change the color of your web page text to red. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and let's start off by just erasing what we got here in the body. Let's do an H1, and we'll say hello world. Okay, we'll start off by saying if this is the only element we have that we need to change, we'll just use an ID selector. Okay, remember IDs for 1. So I'm going to call this greeting, and then I need to add my style sheet. So to do that, I'll go ahead and add it in my root here, and I'll call it styles.css. From here, to load this in, I need to place a link inside my head. So I'll say link href pointing to styles/css. Okay, so now if we save all, and we inspect, go to network, refresh, you can see that not only is it loading in my HTML doc, it's also loading in my CSS style sheet. Okay, so now we know that's successful, we can go ahead and target the greeting element and update its color. So what I'm going to do is within the styles CSS, I'm going to say hashtag greeting, followed by a pair of brackets. Then I'll pass it in the key value pair of styles. So in our case, we'll say color is equal to red. So now it's going to target the element, the ID of greeting, and update its color to red. So we save all, we refresh. As we can see, we get that red color. Okay. So now let's consider if we have a couple H1s. Okay. Well, now instead of using ID selector, I can use an element selector because ID is only meant for 1. So if I use an ID on both, I'd have to say something like greeting 1, greeting 2, And then I'd just be repeating myself inside here. So to avoid that, we can just get rid of the ID altogether. We can reference all these elements by their type since they're the same. So I'll go ahead and head to my style sheet, and I'll target all H1s and apply the color of blue. So we save all, we refresh. We can see that even though these don't have an ID on them, I was able to target them by their element name, right? And group them all together. Next, let's go ahead and let's consider if we had multiple elements that had different types. So this is element 1, element 2, and element 3, okay? So if they all have different element types, you know, we don't want to have to assign an ID to each one, because again, we'll be repeating ourselves in here. So to avoid that, we can use a class selector. Okay, in a class, we'll group them together regardless of element type. So I'm just going to say this is a color red class. Now, within my style sheet, I can reference that using a dot. So let's say color dash red, and then I will apply that style accordingly. Okay, so now it's going to target all elements with that class and apply that style. So let's save all, and we refresh. You can see that regardless of element type, they are all getting the same style applied using a class selector. Okay, so now let's go and explore the descendant selector. So as I mentioned, if say we had a form, and inside that form, let's say you have an input element, and let's say you also have a button. Okay, and let's say you want to update the style of these elements, you know, without affecting the parent. So what we can do is use a descendant selector. So what I'm going to say is I'll start with the input, and I'll say form space input, and now apply a style. So let's just say the background color is going to be yellow. And then if I want style the button, I could do the same approach. I could say form.button, and let's just change maybe the color to red. Okay. So now using our descendant selector, so we can save all, refresh, we can see that it's applying those styles to the elements, just as we planned. Okay, so now let's go ahead and let's finish off with a pseudo selector. And if you mentioned, this defines a special state and only applies a style when the state is met. So let's go ahead and let's say we have a simple H1. If it's the only element we have, we'll give it an ID, call it greeting. And then to apply a pseudo selector, let's say each time we hover over this element, we want to, give it a color. So if that's the case, we can go ahead and we could say hashtag greeting colon hover, and then I would apply the style color blue. Okay, so now it's going to target this greeting element by its ID, and it will only apply the style where this state is met. So we refresh, and we can see that every time we hover over this element using a pseudo selector, it then applies that style. Okay, moving right along, let's talk about the CSS box model. So the CSS box model is an invisible box that wraps around every HTML element. It consists of three main layers: the margins, borders, padding. And then inside that, we've got the actual content itself. Okay? So whenever we're styling the padding, we need to reference pixel ranges for all four sides of the box. Whenever we're styling margin, we need to do the same approach, except we just got to keep in mind that the padding is spacing on the inside and the margin is the spacing on the outside. And then the border is the space between each of these. And for that, we just need to specify a pixel thickness, pattern, and color. So let's go ahead and style an element. On our web page, have the following specifications: 10 pixels padding on all four sides, 1 pixel solid black border, and 50 pixels margin on all four sides. So let's go ahead And let's just apply that to our green element here. So I'll go ahead and I will say the padding of this element, there we go, is going to be 10 pixels on each side. Okay, and then we'll do the border. Okay. Remember, the padding is spacing on the inside, so the border is the barrier between the inside and outside. So we just need to specify a pixel thickness. So I'll say 1 pix, and we need to specify a pattern. So I'll say solid, and then we need to specify the color, which I'll just say black at this time. Next, we need to specify the margin. So I'm going to do the same approach as I did with the padding, except I'm going to do a little bit more for the margin. So now to see this in action, we can save all and we can refresh our browser. We can see that we have some spacing pushing this element away from the default position. So the best way to see this is to simply inspect the element, and then we can see that actually highlights the layers of the box model. Down here we actually have the box model itself. So inside the actual content, then we got the padding. As you can see, the green layer is the space on the inside of the box. Then we got the border, which is the line between the inside and outside. And finally, we got the margin. The margin is spacing on the outside. And by using these, we can move around our elements and position them in places we want to create our user interface. Next, let's talk about font family. Okay, so the font family property specifies the font for an element. So as you can see, we just target the element, and then we throw in a font family followed by the font name. Okay, and then as well as those built-in fonts, we also can use custom fonts. And they're fonts that can be loaded in and used in place of default browser fonts. As you can see, we use that same approach, except instead of passing in the built-in font name, we pass in the custom font name. So let's go ahead and change the font family of our web doc to the browser font monospace, and then we'll change it to a Google font. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to target all the elements within my body, and I will give them the font family monospace. So if we save all and we refresh our browser, we can see that it updates to this typewriter-like font. Okay? And so while that does work, sometimes you'll be working with companies or designs that require a very specific kind of font, and this sometimes will require you bring in a custom font. So if you're going to do that, we recommend using Google Fonts. So if you just go to Google, you can type in Google Fonts, and then from there you can explore all the different fonts they have. So we'll just scroll down here. Let's say we find one we like. So we just click on Add, and from here, it gives you a standard embed method. So we'll just take this link, go to our index, and we'll place it right above our custom script. That way we can load in the font first. Then once the font's loaded in, we can specify the font family, Rometta 1. And as you notice, they also allow us to specify a backup font in case this one fails to load in. So in our style sheet, I will simply pass in font family Rometta 1. So we save all. We refresh our browser. As we can see, we're getting that custom font, just like that. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and wrap up CSS with the topic of media queries. So a media query is used to apply CSS styles depending on a device's general types, specific characteristics such as width or the browser viewport or environment. Okay, so as you can see, we simply use this media syntax here, and then the actual selector itself followed by the style. And within this parentheses field goes the actual expression. So let's go ahead and set up a media query in our style sheet to change the font size of a body element to 50 pixels when the screen width is above 800. So I'm going to go ahead and we'll hop in our style sheet here, and we'll start by saying @media. And then we'll say the min width of the screen is going to be 800 pixels. Okay, and at that time, we will target the greeting element, and we'll change the font size to 50 pixels. Okay, so let's go ahead and save all and see this in action. Okay, so we refresh, and we can see that as long as the min width is 800, it applies that style. Then when we go below that and it's no longer true, then it will no longer apply that style. Right? And this is how we can create, responsive web design by using, those media queries. All right, let's go ahead and take a moment to open up the floor, and let's see if anyone has any questions so far. Okay, so the floor is open. If you have questions, feel free to ask those now. Okay, don't hear anyone, so I'm assuming we're all good. So let's go ahead and let's move forward to the topic of JavaScript. Okay, so JavaScript is a cross-platform object-oriented scripting language. And in short, it's going to bring life to our page, right? So whenever our buttons are clicked, we're going to be able to run events and those kind of things. Okay, so let's go ahead and first start off by talking about JavaScript variables. So variables are containers for data stored within a browser session. And we got a couple different ways we can create variables. We've got the var keyword, which is a dynamic variable that does not use block scope. We'll talk about that in a bit. We've got the let keyword, which is a dynamic variable that does use block scope. Again, we'll talk about that down the line. And then we've got the const keyword, which creates an immutable variable. Okay, so the difference between a dynamic variable and immutable variable is the fact that a dynamic variable can be changed after creation, whereas an immutable variable cannot. So next, let's talk about the data types we can assign to these variables. Okay, so the first data type is a string, and that's just text data. The second data type is a number, and that's integer data. And then a Boolean is what's considered a true or false data. Okay, very much like binary, ones or zeros, right? And then an object is a collection of key value pairs of data. And then finally, we have an array, which is a collection of index data. So let's go ahead and create a variable for each data type: string, number, Boolean, object, and array. So we'll start with the string, and we'll use the var keyword to do this. Okay, so I'll say var. And then to declare the name of the variable, normally it needs to be intuitive to what data it's storing. So let's say it's going to store the value of my name. So it's going to store the value of my name. Oops, looks like I'm in a style sheet here. So let's take a moment to bring in a JavaScript file. Okay, so let's just say touch app.js. Okay, and very similar to like we did with our style sheet here, we'll go ahead and we'll load in the script app.js. Okay, so we save all, we go to our network, and we refresh. See, it's loading in our style sheet as well. I'm sorry, our script file as well as our document and style sheets. Okay, so now we know that's working. We can go to our app.js file. We can start by creating a var keyword, declaring the name of our variable. We'll call it my name. We'll assign some string data. Okay, so a string is text that goes between a pair of quotes. So I'll go ahead and I'll say Joe. Okay, and then we can use a tool called console.log. And this tool is somewhat of a diagnostics tool that lets us see what's going on under the hood, so to speak. Okay, so whenever we run this, it's going to tell us the value of the variable. So we refresh the browser. You can see that it prints out over here, Joe. Okay, so that's the first and most traditional approach to creating a variable. Now, kind of new improved approach is to use the let keyword. And let works the same way in var as var in the way that we assign a variable, right? So I could just say my name equals Jack. And it will still give me that same outcome, right? So as you can see, Jack gets printed out. Okay. So again, the difference between var and let really has to do with how they behave inside functions. And we'll get into that down the line. But for now, we can see that they allow us just to store a given value. And then, as well as that, the var and let keywords are dynamic, which means they can be changed after creation. So to explore this, we could set up an additional line which reassigns the name to Jane. And because the script is read from top to bottom, it'll start off and it will assign it to Jack at first, but then it's going to reassign it to Jane. And because that's the last thing that was assigned to in memory, by the time it hits this console log, that's what it will print out. So we save all, we refresh. As we can see, we get that given value. Okay, so while that is great, and you know, it's oftentimes useful for specific situations like incrementing an integer and such. Sometimes we don't want our variables to be able to change. Sometimes we want them to be protected from being overwritten. Something like the company name, for example. We know for the life of a website, the company name is pretty much never going to change. So we want to make sure that doesn't get overwritten. And so to do that, we're going to use the const keyword. Okay, so now if I try to take company name and reassign it to another company, well, this operation won't go through because const keyword does not allow that. So we refresh, and as we can see, we get the error. Assignment is to a constant, right? And that's good. We've protected this from being overwritten. So depending on your situation, sometimes you're going to want to use a dynamic variable such as let or var, but sometimes you're going to want to use constant. So practice makes perfect in that regard. Okay, so let's explore some of these other data types here. We've already seen how the string works. So let's go ahead and let's explore number data type. Okay, and the useful part about number data type is we have the ability to perform arithmetic operations. Let's go ahead and consider we have a variable called my age equal to 99. And then we can create a variable called next year's age, which would be equal to my age plus 1. And because my age is technically a number, it will allow me to run that operation. So I'm going to go and console log the value of next year's age. So we save all, and we refresh, and we see we get that calculated result. And we're not just limited to addition. We can do subtraction, addition, multiplication, all that good stuff. Okay, so next data type we'll talk about is Boolean. Okay, so like we mentioned before, Boolean is simply a true or false outcome. So let's go ahead and consider we have a variable called encode. I like to think that's true, so I'm going to pass in true Boolean. And as you notice, it's simply the English word true without a pair of quotes. That's how the browser knows to interpret it as a Boolean. Let's say, however, maybe I had a variable called advance. And that's definitely not true, so I could put false. And as you can see, same thing here, just the word false without any quotes around it. Okay, and you might be asking yourself, well, how is that useful? It really goes back to decision making. Okay, and so when your program needs to make decisions, oftentimes it's going to use Booleans to evaluate, if this is true, run this operation, otherwise run this one, right? That's the kind of thinking there. So next, let's go ahead and let's create an object data type. Okay, and let's explore why we would want to create one in the first place. So if we didn't use objects, if we just use single variable values to store everything, we'd end up doing something like this. Say we had a program with multiple users. So for the first user, maybe I would give the name Joe. If I had another user, I'd have to create another variable. And then if I had more characteristics about those users, I'd create even more variables. Okay, so as you can see, this is getting out of hand pretty quickly. It's not very maintainable. Okay? And so what we can do instead is we can group these together using key value pairs within an object. Okay, so I'm just going to say user1 equals pair of curly brackets. Then within that pair of curly brackets, I'm going to put a key value pair. So key value pair looks like this. We'd have a name, colon, Joe. Okay, and then I can separate multiple key value pairs with a comma. And then I can put age 99. So as you notice, I'm storing all these values under a single variable entity now. Let's do the same thing with user2. So name equals Jack, age equals number. So now let's console log the value of user 1. If we save all and refresh, we can see that we get an object just as expected. So now the question comes, well, how do we extract these values from the object when we need them? Okay, and we can use one of two approaches. We can use dot notation, or we can use bracket notation. So dot notation works by referencing the object, then putting a dot and referencing the property in which you want the value from. So if I want the name of user 1, I would say user1 dot name. And from here, I can save all, and I can refresh. You can see that instead of getting the entire object back, we only get this value. Okay? And then bracket notation works similar. We first reference the object we want to get the value from, and we put a pair of square brackets after it, and we reference the property in which we want the value for. So let's say we want the age of user 2. So we would say user 2 at the index of age. Save all and refresh, and as you can see, we get that value printed out. Okay, and so now let's go ahead and explore an array. Okay, so an array is similar to an object, except instead of using key value pairs, we're going to store indexed values. So I'll create a variable called friends. I'll make it equal to a pair of square brackets. Then I'm going to pass in single values. So I'll just say Joe, and I'll separate each value with a comma. Say Jack, Jane, and Jill. Okay, so now let's go ahead and console log the value of friends. So we save all and refresh, and as you can see, we get a nice array of friends. But you might notice that we get a special number next to each one of these, okay, and that's known as its index position. Okay, and using that index position, we can obtain the value from the array. So let's say we want the value of Joe. So I'd say friends at the index of 0, because Joe is at the index of 0. Okay, so we save all, and we refresh. Instead of getting the entire array back now we're only getting that given value. Right, and that goes for maybe if we want Jill, right, she's the index of 3, we would just change that up. There you go. Okay, so next, let's talk about conditionals in JavaScript. So a conditional is a statement that executes a block of code if a specified condition is true. So we got the basic if statement, which runs a block of code whenever a given expression is true. We got the else if statement, which runs a block of code when the if statement's false and the else if expression is true. And then we have an else statement, which runs if all other expressions violate the false. So let's go ahead and create an operation for each of these conditionals, see them in action. So we'll go ahead and start with the if statement. And the if statement, we just need to pass an expression. So I'll say 10 is greater than 5. And if this evaluates to true, then it will run this block of code. And we know that 10 is greater than 5 is true. So we can go ahead and console log 10 is greater than 5. Okay, so from here we can save all. We can refresh our browser. We can see that it evaluates the expression and runs the code based on the fact that this is true. Now if we took this and we said 10 is greater than 50, well, now it's going to evaluate to false. So that means it's just not going to run this code at all. As you can see, no console log. So if we want to add a secondary expression to evaluate, we can throw in an else if statement. Okay, now I can say if 4 is greater than 3. If that's true, it'll run this block of code. So we save all, refresh, and we can see that it evaluates the first if statement, evaluates to false, so it jumps to the second, the else if, and because this evaluates to true, it runs this block of code. However, if this, it says 4 is greater than 30, well, now both of these will evaluate to false. Okay, so if all these evaluate to false, we can use something called an else statement to run in that case. Okay, and in case all of them are false, we will simply log none of the above. Okay, so we save all, and we refresh, and we can see that it evaluates both of these. Both these evaluate to false, so it runs this last resort right here. Okay, and that's how we can set up a JavaScript conditional. Next, let's talk about the for loop in JavaScript. So a for loop executes a loop as long as a specified condition is true. Okay, normally this is used to work with collections because oftentimes on the client side, we're dealing with collections of unknown length. When you don't know the length of the collection, that means you don't know the index position of the elements in the collection. If you don't know the index position, that means you can't get the value. So this is where a loop comes in handy, and a loop allows us to iterate through a collection and run the needed functionality. So I'm going to go ahead and start off by creating a collection of friends. We'll say Joe, Jack, Jane, Jill. And then to loop through these friends and greet each one, we could use a for loop. So we say for, and then we pass in 3 arguments. The first is where to start the loop. I'm going to start the index of 0. Okay, so that's Joe. Semicolon. And then the second thing I need to pass in is when to stop the loop. So I'll say stop it whenever I is less, no, keep it going as long as I is less than friends.length. Semicolon, and then increase I by 1 each loop. So now within this block here, I have access to all the elements in the array using this dynamic variable. So I'm going to simply console log hello space friends at the index of I. Because I is 0 on the first loop, and friends at the index of 0 equals Joe, it's going to say hello Joe. Then I'll go to the next loop, at which time I becomes 1, and friends at the index of 1 becomes Jack. And they'll say hello Jack. And it'll just keep going until I is no longer less than friends.length. So to see this in action, let's save all, and let's refresh our browser. As you can see, we're able to create all of our friends without having to know their specific index position. All right, so we could come in here if we wanted, and we could even add more friends. Okay, and we don't even have to adjust a for loop down here. It's just going to automatically account for the new elements in the array and read those accordingly. Right, and that's why I say it's used oftentimes when we're dealing with collections of unknown length, right? Because then we can just iterate through and perform what functions we need to. Okay, so that once again is called a for loop. Next, let's talk about a JavaScript function. Okay, so a function is an executable, repeatable block of code. We got a couple different ways of creating them in JavaScript. We've got a function statement, which is a function statement declaring a new function for later use. And then we got function expression, and that's a variable whose, it's a variable whose stored value is a function. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's talk about an object method now. Okay, so an object method is an object property containing a function definition. Okay, so it's very similar to a function in that way, except it's within an object. So let's go ahead and create function statement, function expression, and an object method, which will console log hello world when invoked. So we'll go ahead and start with a function statement. And to create a function statement, we use the keyword function, and then maybe I would just go say greet here. Okay, and then to activate, or what's more commonly referred to as invoke this function, I simply need to reference the function by name and pass in given arguments. So in my case, I'm going to pass in the name of Joe. Okay, and what I can do from here is populate this field with a parameter. Parameter, I'll go ahead and just call n, and n will represent this argument value. So that being said, I can console log the value of n. So I'll say hello space n. Okay, so we save all. We refresh our browser. As you can see, we get hello Joe as the result. Okay, so function expression is very similar, except it's a variable whose value is equal to a function, just like that. Okay, so we save all, we refresh. Okay, as you can see, we get that similar execution. So you might be asking yourself, okay, well, what's the difference between this function expression, the function statement? The main difference is with a function statement, you have what's called hoisting. And what that means is I can invoke the function above or below the declaration. Whereas a function expression, I cannot. I have to invoke it below. So see this in action. If we took this invocation and we moved it above the declaration, well, now we get an error, right? Because technically greet is not defined using a function expression. However, if we were to use a function statement instead, well, now it doesn't care if we invoke it above or below, because using hoisting, it'll be hoisted to the top of the stack. So we save all, we refresh, you can see we get that normal execution. Okay, so let's go ahead and see an object method in action now. Okay, so like we mentioned, this is just an object whose property contains a function definition. So let's say I have a object called person, and for the name, I gave it a function definition. The function definition will return jump. So to invoke this, I could simply say person dot name invoke. Because it returns a string, that's what will be printed out. So we refresh. Now you can see, using this object method, we're able to obtain that result. And as you notice, it looks very similar to a regular function, except we always called it a method anytime it's inside a class or an object like this. Okay, so let's wrap up with the topic of scope. So scope refers to the accessibility of a variable within an executing script. We've got a couple different kinds of scope. So first one is global scope. And that's when a variable is declared outside the scope of all function blocks. Next, we've got function scope. And that's when a variable is declared inside the scope of a function block. And then we've got block scope, which is when a variable is declared using the let keyword and scope to the containing function or script. So let's go ahead and create a variable that uses global, function, and block scope. So we'll start with global scope. And like we mentioned a minute ago, we have to declare it outside the scope of all functions. So I'll do it at the top here, I'll call it counter equal to 0. Then I'll create a function called increment. And the job of the increment function will be to take the value of counter and increment it by 1. And then we'll print out that new value to the console. So now I'm going to take my increment function and I'm going to connect it with a button click event. So I'm going to say on click equals increment invoke. Okay, so now each time this button's clicked, it will run our increment function, at which time it will add 1 to the value of counter. You'll notice I'm able to console log counter outside the function and inside the function. And that's why it's called global scope, because it's globally available everywhere. So we save all, and we refresh. Okay, we can see we get the value of 0, right? That's this console log being printed out first. And then each time we click on increment here, we can see that it runs the increment function, and we're now seeing this console log printing out the new value. Okay, and once again, that's called global scope. So now if we were to take this declaration here, and we were to move it inside the function, well, now it's what's considered function scope. And function scope means this function only exists, a variable only exists inside this function. Okay, so if I'm trying to console log it outside, well, I'm going to get an error now because it's not technically defined outside this function. See, if we refresh, we can see that it's letting us know counter is not defined. Another thing to mention is because it's declared inside the function, each time we click increment now, it's going to redeclare the value of counter to 0 and then increment it to 1. So we'll never actually see it get past the value 1 now. So when we refresh, you see that no matter how many times I click on increment, we get that result. Okay? So now let's see how block scope works. And if we remember, block scope has to do with the difference between the var and let keywords. So we'll start off by creating a function called a scope test. And we'll use the var keyword first. Declare x equal to 4. Then we'll use conditional. We'll pass in true to force it to run. And then within this block, we'll declare x equal to 1. And we'll console log the value of x. And then within the scope of this function, we'll console log x. And because var keyword does not use block scope, what's going to happen is, because 1 was the last thing that was assigned in memory, it's going to then assign this x to 1 as well. Okay, so let's save all, refresh, and we're ready to invoke. Scope test, initiate. Okay, and as we can see, we get 1 and 1. And that's bad. We don't want our scopes overriding each other like that. So to avoid that, we use the let keyword. Okay, and now let is going to bind this to the containing function, right? And so it won't allow it to be reassigned. So we save all. And we refresh. We can see we get 1 and 4 now, which are, you know, the appropriate values for each of these. Okay, and that's, once again, what's referred to as block scope. Alrighty. So let's go and open up the floor one last time, see if anyone has any remaining questions. So the floor is open. If you have questions, feel free to ask them now. All right, don't hear anyone. Going once, going twice. All right, we're out of here. Thank you everyone for stopping by. Have a great rest of your day and happy coding out there.